the emphasis on local currencies, on national currencies being used in trade, I think the number was something like 90% of trade between BRICS countries is happening in their own respective currencies. That is very significant. And I think it's emblematic of a larger problem that the US sees with BRICS is that de-dollarization, this move toward independent economic and financial development amongst themselves, is not only such a huge response to the weaponization of the dollar and the US empire as a whole, but it fulfills a process that has gone through a lot of bumps, but is still going on, which is full independence for the global south from their former colonial and imperial masters, or their current imperial and colonial masters. That seems to me the big problem that BRICS poses.
Yeah, I was very glad to see that both Lula and Anwar of Malaysia mentioned colonialism and decolonization. And Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, gave a very interesting speech. And I was actually pleasantly surprised by how pretty revolutionary it was. Again, he invoked the legacy of the non-aligned movement and the Bandung Conference. He mentioned several anti-colonial leaders in the global south who were all, revolutionary leftists, including Zhou Enlai, who is probably the second most powerful person in China after Mao, in the Mao era. He mentioned Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the founding father of India, the anti-colonial leader, who was himself, a left-wing leader. And he mentioned Sukarno, who was a socialist anti-colonial leader in Indonesia. So hearing the Prime Minister of Malaysia mention these leaders as a positive example, I think is very positive. Also, by the way, I forgot to mention, he also invoked, he mentioned the name of Kwame Nkrumah, who was the revolutionary socialist leader of Ghana, an anti-colonial leader. And it's especially important that he mentioned Nkrumah because Nkrumah was the author of neocolonialism. So Nkrumah famously argued, by the way, Nkrumah was the victim of a US-backed coup, like, Allende in Chile and so many other leftist leaders in the global south, like Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in Guatemala, Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2019. So anyway, Nkrumah wrote this book, Neocolonialism, in which he argued that after the end of formal political colonialism by the European powers, there was a system of neocolonialism in which the Western colonial powers still controlled the global financial institutions and trade with their former colonies, and they basically controlled the economies of many of these countries in the global south because even though they kicked out their colonial masters, their economies were underdeveloped, they were not industrialized, and they were reliant entirely on trade with their former colonial masters. And in the case of West Africa, which is where Nkrumah was from, it was especially important because France controlled the currency of West African countries in the CFA franc system, which was previously, the name of it was the Colonia Françafrique, literally colonial. That was in the name, and they renamed it. They changed it, but it's a colonial currency. And still today, in Western Africa, there are several countries that use this French currency controlled by France, even though France itself doesn't even use the franc anymore. France uses the euro. So when we talk about neocolonialism, it's not just a hypothetical. It's not just theoretical. Neocolonialism is deeply embedded in the structure of global capitalism, of international financial institutions that the US dominates, like the IMF, like the World Bank, which we've been talking about. So BRICS is about transforming these international financial institutions and creating true multilateral financial institutions so they can decolonize the global economy so you can actually have true decolonization. So I think hearing Lula and Anwar talk about that, I think that was very important because it makes it clear that this is one of the key missions of BRICS, following in the footsteps of the non-aligned movement.
BRICS in their 2025 summit declaration made a number of statements that were significant. There was a statement condemning Ukrainian attacks on Bryansk, Kursk, and other regions of Russia. There was also condemnation of the attacks on Iran by Israel, but of course with US backing. Of course, there was the declaration of a full and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza. The major countries leading BRICS, Russia, China, now Iran as a newer member. But despite all of the disagreements that these countries in BRICS might have, I mean, we have China and India at the table with major disagreements. When you have all these BRICS countries with very different political systems, political orientations, they were able to agree on, I think, pretty significant points that are maybe being understated, but might speak to some of the fear that the U.S. has of BRICS uniting more and more the global South against these endless wars.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. When we talk about security, we should keep in mind that BRICS, I see BRICS fundamentally as an organization focused more on the economy, on finance and politics, not so much security. Security is more the purview of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which many BRICS countries are part of. However, as you pointed out, BRICS did mention security because they had a very long, comprehensive statement, the Rio de Janeiro Declaration. It was 31 pages, and it had over 100 different points that they addressed. So given all of that, they talked about climate change, which is a big thing, and the responsibility of the global north, the colonizing countries that caused the majority of climate change and carbon emissions, and yet the global south is suffering the worst consequences and needs funding, but the global north refuses to provide funding. That was a big discussion. Poverty reduction was important. Also development, also, of course, de-dollarization and all of that. Culture was discussed, tourism and all of that. But of course, security was part of it. And as you mentioned, they condemned the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran and Gaza and called for peace in Ukraine and all of this. But in terms of the way that BRICS sees security, I think it's the way that many global South countries see security, which is the opposite of the way the U.S. sees security. The U.S. sees security as the U.S. empire must control everything. If the U.S. doesn't control everything, it's not secure. If the U.S. can't overthrow any government it doesn't like, it's not secure. If the U.S. can't wage war wherever it wants and send troops wherever it wants and do military exercises off the coast of China, then it's not secure. Whereas BRICS has a collective view of security, which is that you cannot talk about security when other countries are also threatened by what you consider to be your security. And this gets back to the whole conflict in Ukraine. Russia has made it always clear that any security guarantees provided have to be mutual. That yes, that if the U.S., if the West, the U.S.-led NATO forces want some kind of security arrangement with Russia, Russia also has to have its own legitimate security demands met. And the U.S. and NATO and the EU refuse to meet them because they don't believe in mutual collective security. They believe in their own security at the expense of other countries. So now BRICS is in this very complicated situation where you have countries like China and India that have had border disputes. They're both members, they're founding members. You also have Iran and the UAE, which are members. Saudi Arabia was invited but has not officially accepted the invitation. But you have these countries that have potential security issues with each other that are all members. So how can they come together and resolve these differences through diplomacy? And they've shown that it's possible. By the way, ASEAN has shown that it's possible. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, there are now multiple countries from ASEAN that are part of BRICS, including Vietnam and Malaysia and Thailand. And also, they have had their own disputes with China in the South China Sea, but they have resolved those disputes and they've come to security agreements through diplomacy, through talks, whereas the U.S. is constantly meddling in Southeast Asia, trying to encourage conflict. So I think BRICS has actually shown that this is a model for what collective security can actually look like. And I already mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think that's an even better model because in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you also not only have China, Russia, and Iran and India, you also have Pakistan. And obviously, India and Pakistan have major security issues with each other, but they're all part of an organization. They meet every year and they discuss ways to peacefully resolve some of these issues through diplomacy. So I think, again, although I would not define BRICS as fundamentally an organization focused on security, it is something that they talk about. And I think that is a model for what this multipolar world could look like if, the US and Western imperial powers actually accept the end of their empires, accept the peaceful integration of the West into the rest of the world, and accept that they're just countries. They're not special countries. They're just countries like everyone else.
You see, even among people who follow our work, there's a lot of underestimation. There's a lot of, oh, well, these countries aren't as strong as they say they are. Russia, China, Iran. BRICS is not as strong as it says it is, or maybe it's portrayed by independent observers, because it can't mollywop, it can't destroy the United States' hegemony in a snap. But I think what I've always argued, Ben, and what I see BRICS doing, and of course the rest of the multipolar world doing, is that by building these blocks of development, the path toward independent development, one that can exist right now and grow in significant ways, whether it's de-dollarization, investments independent of the US dollar, mutual trade networks, all of these new independent institutions not reliant upon U.S. and Western interference. All of this builds the blocks for real, not only a real kind of security, but also a real legitimate chance at what China talks about, common prosperity. There's actually a chance if these blocks are built and these paths are built, and the response against them by the United States will only heighten that conflict, will only heighten those contradictions, which then of course lead to new kinds and new phases of fight and development itself. So really, I think we are seeing, despite some understandable sometimes impatience, but really what I think is a very kind of Western impatience with the process, I think we're seeing a real significant move forward. And you mentioned the underestimation and the propaganda by the Western media about this summit. Some of that too was, I think, even independent observers were underestimating maybe even Brazil's leadership, Lula's leadership, the idea that Brazil is not led by a Western stooge government right now, that Lula da Silva is actually quite independent and very much one of the few leaders actually calling for the creation of independent currencies itself. But your thoughts on this before we talk about, I want to talk about these drills against China.
Yeah, keep in mind, Lula was a co-founder of BRICS. It was partially his idea. I mean, not just him, but back when it was BRIC, B-R-I-C, before South Africa joined in 2010. It was founded in 2009. So Lula has always been a key supporter of the multipolar project in the Global South and understands that Latin America must unite and be independent of U.S. imperialism. Now, he has to be very careful. Anyone in Latin America has to be very careful, because if not, they'll end up like Cuba, under a brutal, suffocating U.S. blockade, facing coup attempts and sanctions and all of that. They have to be or Venezuela. I mean, the brutal blockade against Venezuela, trying to destroy the Venezuelan economy. So obviously, you have to be very careful in Latin America, and Lula is. He's not Fidel Castro, but he's always been a strong supporter of Brazil, working with other countries in Latin America and Africa and Asia to build a more multipolar world. And the fact that Brazil over time has deepened its economic integration with China and is less and less dependent on trade with the US has made it a little more possible for him to stand up even more to the US, even than before. This is his third term as president. Unlike compared to, say, Mexico, right? 80% of Mexico's exports go to the US. 80%. I mean, that's a level of dependency that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world other than Canada, right? And look how the US treats Canada. Trump is talking about annexing, colonizing Canada. So Mexico has to be very, very careful. But even that said, the current Mexican government is completely sovereign, non-aligned in its foreign policy. It has a left-wing, anti-colonial government under President Claudia Sheinbaum. She's been very impressive. And the previous president, AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, they were both very impressive in how they were balancing carefully their relations with the US and the Global South. And the fact that Lula invited Mexico to participate in the BRICS summit as an observer, and President Sheinbaum accepted the invitation and sent Mexico's foreign minister, De La Fuente, that is a very important symbolic move that shows to the US that even a country like Mexico, that is more dependent than any other country on earth on trade with the US. Even Mexico is telling the US, you have to stop bullying everyone and treating us like colonies. We are not colonies. We are independent, sovereign countries. Now, another quick point here. You were talking about security, and this is related. Another point that I wanted to mention that I forgot to mention is that I talked about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is not a military alliance at all. Obviously, it's not, because you have India and Pakistan are both members. And BRICS is even less so. It's never going to be a military alliance, ever, in a million years. It's not what it is. And I think it's important to look at, when we're talking about the decline of U.S. imperialism in a multipolar world and what the multipolar world could look like, there are different possibilities. There's a multipolar world like World War I, where you have a lot more war and conflict. But there's also the kind of multipolar world that is envisioned by BRICS, by Brazil, and by China, which could be potentially a more peaceful multipolar world without imperialism. And I think China actually has shown what that could look like, because China is not a member of a military alliance. And even though we've talked about this, you and I, Denny, even though China and Russia have the best relations they've ever had in their history, and they say it's solid as a rock, and they always reaffirm that, they do not have a military alliance. China does not have a military alliance with anyone, and China does not refer to its partnership with Russia as an alliance. It's a comprehensive strategic partnership. And I actually really I think China and also Vietnam and ASEAN countries can be a good model for what the multipolar world could look like, including also in terms of security, right? Because I mentioned that in ASEAN, they have border disputes in the South China Sea, right, with their different islands and stuff. Vietnam, I think, has a very sensible policy of the four no's, where Vietnam says it will not join a military alliance, it will not engage in a war against another country, it will not allow foreign countries to build military bases in Vietnamese territory, and it will not join in a form of military alliance. It has a non-aligned foreign policy. Like, I think that is a very sensible policy that many countries could be able to pursue. And China basically has the same thing. It doesn't call it the four no's, but that's what Vietnam calls it. It's basically the same policy. And I think BRICS, if you looked at their philosophy, I think it's basically a very similar philosophy based on non-interference and non-alignment. And I don't think the U.S. will pursue that unless there's a revolution in the U.S., which it's desperately needed in the U.S. as a revolution. But when we're talking about BRICS, I just wanted to highlight that point that I had forgotten to mention, and what you said there reminded me of that there is a model for what the future of international relations and conflict resolution could look like. And I see the seeds of that in China and Vietnam, and they're very sensible models. And Brazil, more quick point. And Brazil, Latin America, by the way, has declared itself a region of peace, a zone of peace. And the only violent conflicts in Latin America that we've seen in the past century have been U.S. conflicts, U.S. fueled wars. The U.S. invaded Panama, the U.S. invaded Grenada, the U.S. supported the contra-terrorist death squads in Nicaragua, the U.S. supported the violent drug war in Mexico, the U.S. supported the violent drug war in Colombia, and there was a very low-level civil war in Colombia that was sponsored by the U.S. through Plan Colombia that would have ended without U.S. support. It was basically a war against the left in Colombia. But in terms of these are internal conflicts. Obviously, the drug war in Mexico has been horrible and very violent, and the U.S. bears a big role in that as well. But I'm saying that there haven't been interstate conflicts in this region. It's a zone of peace, and Latin America has always emphasized that it's a zone of peace and resolved their disputes diplomatically, like Southeast Asia. So it's possible for this to happen. It's not like some utopian vision. The problem is imperialism. You cannot have peace that coexists with imperialism, and BRICS is making that very clear as well.
A lot of talk about during the Iran-Israel 12-day war, whatever we want to call it, really the U.S.-Israeli aggression against Iran. There was a lot of fear, and I think some of that stoked by we could call our enemies, and even some of our friends were talking about how, okay, China, Russia, they don't do enough to help Iran. Iran doesn't do enough to help themselves by aligning more with Russia and China militarily. And what's so interesting about this, as I've been thinking about it, Ben, is that this seems to understate, one, how important it is for countries like Iran and really the entire global South to be able to both defend themselves and develop themselves independently. And that this Cold War mentality that is over a century old is one that is very much rejected by especially the leaders of the multipolar world, but really the entire global South at this point. That's probably one thing that almost everyone could agree on within BRICS, for example. And then it does understate, too, how much it matters for countries like China, for example, to stay out and not interfere in the affairs directly in other countries, but yet do very helpful and useful things, which probably saved Iran and has saved Iran in these many years of war, economic war with the sanctions. And now we just saw one of the most aggressive attempts to militarily defeat Iran. If it weren't for example, its huge economic relationship with China, if it wasn't for all of the assistance diplomatically, militarily, economically as well with Russia, and of course now being a BRICS member and having countries within BRICS defiantly break sanctions to work with Iran, if it wasn't for all of that, Iran would probably not be standing. So I think that's one point I want to emphasize that I think some miss. I don't know if you have any comments on this.
The reason that China has not been involved in a war since 1979 is precisely because it takes this issue very seriously. China does not join in military alliances because that could drag China also into war, right? And it makes the possibility of war sometimes more likely. Look at NATO. There's this idea that supposedly NATO was to prevent war. NATO is just, it's a force of war and imperialism. They destroyed Yugoslavia. They destroyed Libya. They're destroying Ukraine. They're preparing for more war with Russia. I mean, it's crazy. You listen to all these people in Europe saying as if Russia's going to like march into Paris. It's absurd. So China, by being non-aligned, by not having military alliances, it's one of the ways it's been able to not be involved in a war since 1979. The U.S. is at war every year. So again, we have to think about these issues in a very different way. And this is what BRICS is trying to do. But obviously, it's very difficult to do when you're dealing with this just monstrous war machine in the U.S. that's just constantly, everywhere it goes, destroying countries, leaving behind rubble in Libya and Syria and Yemen, and trying in Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, and then now threatening China and Russia and Ukraine and Yugoslavia. I mean, everywhere it goes, it just destabilizes countries. That's part of the, by the way, that's the goal. I mean, that's how they profit. That's how U.S. corporations profit from all of this. It's not the side effect, it's the intended impact. So we have to have a complete change of the global order. And this is what BRICS is trying to do. But at the same time, I mean, if you think about how many significant watershed shifts happened in world history, it was in major wars. So World War I led to the rise of fascism. World War II led to the collapse of European empires. And decolonization would not have been possible without World War II because the European empires destroyed themselves, right? And a Japanese empire. So, and you have these massive, the U.S. Civil War was what really made the abolition of slavery possible. So when you have these significant changes, the Russian Revolution was really only solidified after the Russian Civil War, the internal war, which wasn't really a civil war because there were a dozen imperialist countries that invaded the Soviet Union right after the Russian Revolution, including the US. The Chinese Revolution was only possible after World War II and an internal civil war. So you have these massive political shifts in the world. The creation of Bretton Woods and the United Nations was because of World War II. Now, what I'm getting at here is, yes, if we want to completely change this colonial order, it would be possible to just have World War III, and then the West has to lose, and then we create a new order out of that. But we also have nuclear weapons. It's also not guaranteed the U.S. loses. You could have both sides lose. I mean, I don't think the U.S. would win, but I mean, it's very dangerous to say, let's just have war, right? Like, I think there are a lot of people on the internet who, like, you know, there's just these keyboard warriors who say, like, yeah, Iran should sacrifice itself and wage all-out war on Israel, the Israeli regime, which obviously is completely illegitimate, a colonial apartheid regime. But Iran also has to act with patience and restraint because Israel has nuclear weapons. It has the backing of the world's largest military power, the U.S. empire. I mean, and asking like China to just say, okay, you have to engage in World War III to defeat the U.S. empire, which everyone in the world wants the U.S. 80% of the world wants the U.S. empire to be defeated. It's objectively just destroying the planet, but World War III could also destroy the planet. So what I'm getting at here is that be careful what you wish for. Like what BRICS is trying to do is trying to create a new global order, but avoiding World War III. And they have to be very careful to prevent World War III, which is looking increasingly likely. And I personally think we should do everything we can to avoid World War III, given the existence of nuclear weapons and how insane people in Washington are, not just the Republicans, but the Democrats. I mean, a lot of people in Washington would rather commit nuclear war than accept the decline of the U.S. empire.
Yeah.
And BRICS is trying to prevent that.
Maybe people are forgetting that the nuclear option is I think some people may say, well, the nuclear option would destroy everything, so the system wouldn't want to destroy itself. Let's not count chickens before they hatch. That is not an impossibility. If there is any kind of world war, open military conflict between any of these countries, including Iran, even if it's simply Iran, even if something like what happened in the so-called 12-day war, if that were to expand, if the war of attrition were to happen and Israel was looking very much on the ropes, which is likely possible in a war of attrition, what does the United States do? The United States can't conventionally assist Israel to the point where it can last for as long as it can and succeed in its objective of winning. So what does that mean? That means they're going to look at options that Iran doesn't have and that maybe China and Russia are very hesitant to use. Nobody wants to use nuclear weapons or at least nobody else except for the United States wants to use, and maybe Israel, use nuclear weapons for any offensive purposes. They are a deterrent for a reason. China has no first use policy. Russia changed its nuclear doctrine, but for a long time did not have a first use policy. Of course, the DPRK, their policy is we have a nuclear weapon because we need it. And, we can go on and on. But the point is I think people should understand, in the West especially, that if the problem is the U.S. empire and it has thousands of nuclear weapons and it is not going to let go of its empire without a fight, and this is why I constantly emphasize decline. That's because that decline leads more and more to the more desperate options, to the more maybe absolutely insane options like nuclear weapons.